Hello everyone and welcome to Study IQ English. I am Joycey Joy and we are going to discuss about the performance of fiscal indicators during 2021-22 according to the economic survey. And in the fiscal indicators, in the last class, we have already discussed about the revenue collection. Also, we discussed about the deficit, the primary deficit as well as the fiscal deficit and primary deficit of the government of India. Next, we are going to take up expenditure. So, next fiscal indicator that we are going to discuss in detail is the expenditure of the government. Now, coming to the expenditure, first regarding the expenditure policy of the government. Coming to expenditure policy of the government during 2021-22, there was a restructuring and prioritization of expenditures on different sectors. And this, according to the survey, has brought a long-term impact on the output. That is two important things. One is restructuring the expenditure and second one is prioritization. Restructuring and prioritization of expenditure has brought changes or it has brought long-term impact on the output. Now, coming to the total expenditure of the government. The total expenditure of the government has increased by 8.8% from the month of April to November 2021. And in this period, that is in the same period, during April to November 2021, during this period, the government's expenditure, the total expenditure was 59.6% of the budget estimate. So, it was 59.6, more than half of the budget estimate, and which is a growth of 8.8%. Now, coming to revenue expenditure, this is total expenditure. Now, coming to revenue expenditure has increased by 8.2% in this 8 months of April to November, and this is again high as compared to the previous years. Now, let us come to the expenditure part in detail. Prioritization of spending, as I discussed already, prioritization of spending in sectors have given a long-term impact on the output. Now, what is this prioritization? Here, prioritization means that government has identified some priority sectors, that is some important sectors for which the government has to give priority. That is like for example, CAPEX, capital expenditure, then infrastructure, creation of infrastructure, especially road, transportation, etc. Apart from that, health sector. So, these are only a few examples. We will come to the priority sectors for sure. Government identified certain priority sectors and government has increased expenditure on these priority sectors, and this has brought a long-term impact on the output. Output is what we get. Now, coming to subsidies, again this is very important. Subsidies from April to November 2021, the expenditure on major subsidies, it was 2.31 lakh crore. This is between the period of April to November 2021. Now, among the subsidies, the highest allocation was given to food subsidies. So, food subsidy was the major component. Food subsidy became the major component in the total government subsidies. And within the food subsidy, a remarkable or a notable scheme which would be very important for your examination would be Pradhan Mantri Garib Kalyan and Yojana. Pradhan Mantri Garib Kalyan and Yojana. So, implementation of this scheme, especially during the COVID times, it was beneficial for the country at large, especially to the vulnerable people. And this Garib Kalyan Ann Yojana, it requires about 1.47 lakh crore rupees of allocation for the scheme itself. And as we know, Pradhan Mantri Garib Kalyan Ann Yojana, this scheme provides free food grains to the beneficiaries over and above the NFSA monthly allocation. So, free food grains to all the beneficiaries, and this is over and above. Do not get confused. This is over and above the NFSA monthly allocation. So, this is regarding the food subsidy, particularly the Garib, Kalyan and Yojana. Now coming to CapEx, capital expenditure. Focus on capital expenditure, particularly on infrastructure intensive sectors. As we have seen, the CapEx or the capital expenditure of the government has gone up. Emphasis has been given on capital expenditure, and this was one of the major highlights. So emphasis was given on capital expenditure, and capital expenditure has grown by 13.5%. So this is the growth of capital expenditure. So emphasis on capital expenditure has been a highlight, and this particular focus was given on infrastructure intensive sectors to create infrastructure which has multiplier effects. Like infrastructure, how does it have a multiplier effect? It creates infrastructure which obviously leads to development of the economy or the country. On the other side, it can generate a lot of employment opportunities. Apart from that, employment opportunities, it raises the standard of living of people. Then purchasing power increases, demand increases, again production, this virtuous circle will continue. So infrastructure intensive sectors, especially within that infrastructural sector, roads, highways, railways, housing, urban affairs, etc. And apart from government's own spending on infrastructure, the central government also focused on boosting the capital expenditure of the states by giving certain grants, loans, etc. to the state governments, and thereby boost the capital expenditure of the state governments as well. So based on this analysis, we can say that there were two very important factors. One is the agile fiscal policy. What is agile? Agile is very quick, that is very responsive and very quick fiscal policy. How the policy is responsive? It is responsive in the sense that whenever there was a change in the economy, whenever the economy had to undergo certain changes, the policies of the government were also very flexible to adapt to that changes. So that's why agile fiscal policy, that is quick and responsive fiscal policy. Then second one is revenue collection was buoyant. So what is buoyancy? We have already discussed about buoyancy in the last class. Buoyancy means that an increase in the revenue collection as a proportion to the increase in GDP. When we say buoyant, it means that the revenue collection is more proportionate than the GDP growth. That is buoyancy. So revenue collection was buoyant, which means the government could recover revenue at larger scale. And apart from that, the response of the government through fiscal policies were also very quick and very sustained. So these were the two factors. So these two factors put together help the government to focus on capex or capital expenditure and thereby create multiplier effects. Okay, and see, when we speak about revenue collection in particular, that is when we take this revenue buoyancy in particular, one more important fact is that when the revenue collection of the government is high, it gives the government little more fiscal space. That is, when the government collects more money or when government gets more revenue, it gives the government a little bit more fiscal space to spend money, to increase the expenditure net of the government. So it helps the government to create a fiscal space. Okay. Now we are coming to the transfer of government funds to the states. Grants in aid amounting to 2,33,233 crore was given to states during 21-22. And what were the different heads under which it was given? First one was post-devolution revenue deficit grant. Now, what is post-devolution revenue deficit grant? Post-devolution. Let us take this first. Devolution. What is devolution? Devolution is the transfer of funds from center to the state on the recommendation of Finance Commission. So, from central government, from center to the state, transfer of fund from center to the state on the recommendation of Finance Commission. This is known as devolution of taxes. Now, after devolving or after the devolution of taxes from the center to the states, if there is a deficit, then the central government provides grants to the states in order to compensate those deficit. So that is the post-devolution revenue deficit grant. So central government has given the post-devolution revenue deficit grants to the state, then grants to local bodies. That is urban local bodies and also rural local bodies like the panchayats and the municipalities. Panchayats and municipalities. And health sector. Why? Because of the COVID. Because the health sector had faced the most crucial financial crunch during the COVID-19. The health sector needed a lot of investment to cope up with the challenges posed by the COVID-19. The health challenges. When the economy was dealing with the challenges with regard to economic barriers or macroeconomic challenges, the health sector was dealing with the real risk. That is, they were confronting the real risk of challenges to health and well-being of the human beings or the people. Then disaster management grants. So all these together, the total grants given by the center to the states were 2,33,233 crore rupees. Now coming to central government's debt. So this is regarding the central government debt. The total liabilities of the central government as a percentage of GDP, that is debt to GDP ratio. So total liabilities of the central government as a ratio of or as a proportion of GDP, which were relatively stable over the past decade, have risen sharply in 2020-21. This is not about 21-22, the previous year 2021. That is the actual estimates available. So according to the survey, the debt to GDP ratio of the central government were stable for the past many years, but this was hampered during 2021 financial year. In that year, it was not stable. We have seen a sharp rise. So there was a sharp rise in the government's debt as a percentage of GDP. Why? Because the borrowings increased. That is when the government had to confront with the risk of COVID-19, both the health related risk as well as the economic risk. So government had to make investment in the economy to confront with the recession and the economic challenges. And on the other side, health related risk also posed a major challenge for the government to make increased investments in the sector. So these two things. Then most of the external borrowings. Now borrowings can be of two types. Broadly, borrowings can be divided into two. External borrowings and internal borrowings. External borrowings means the borrowings of the government from outside the country, and internal borrowings means the borrowings of the country from within the borrowings of the government from within the country. So internal and external borrowing. External borrowings can again be classified into two, that is multilateral borrowing and bilateral borrowing. Multilateral and bilateral borrowing. Now with regard to multilateral borrowing is when the government borrows money from international institutions like the IMF, World Bank, etc. It is multilateral borrowing. Whereas bilateral borrowing is when a government borrows from a country. That is country to country borrowings or transactions. That is bilateral. Now coming to external borrowings of the government, they were mostly from official sources. That is multilateral borrowings from international organizations, international institutions, etc. and which are of long-term nature and concessional in nature. Long-term means for a very long period of time, 30, 40 or 50 or even for longer periods of time. Then concessional in nature, which means that the interest rate on these borrowings were less. So concessional in nature means interest rate was less. Public debt is largely owned by institutional segments. Now public debt, it is largely owned by institutional segments like banks, insurance companies, provident funds, etc. Then next is a mention about the retail direct scheme by RBI. Now before that we need to understand about government securities, because retail direct scheme is aimed at government securities. Government securities is a kind of borrowings, and as a part of bringing reforms to government borrowings through government securities, this retail direct scheme has been introduced. So what is this retail direct scheme? Earlier, the investors, that is the public who wants to invest in government securities, they had to purchase the government securities from certain scheduled commercial bank assigned by the RBI, which means that the public or the retail investors could not borrow or could not buy government securities directly from the RBI. Now, retail direct scheme, it opens up an opportunity for the retail investors, for the public to buy the government securities directly from the RBI, which means the public or the retail investors can directly purchase the GSECs or the government securities from RBI. Now, how can the public purchase this? It is through gilt accounts. What is a gilt account? A gilt account is an account which is similar to a bank account. In case of a bank account, we transfer money, that is deposit of money and also withdrawal of money. But here, in case of a gilt account, the transactions are in terms of government securities. That is, you can purchase and sell government securities through this gilt accounts. Instead of money, what is transacted is government securities. So any public, any retail investor can buy or can open a gilt account, then buy the government securities through this gilt account directly from the RBI. So this is the concept of retail direct scheme. Then why we are discussing about retail direct scheme under the government debt? Because the government securities are a kind of debt for the government, a kind of borrowings, or it is a borrowing of the government, internal borrowing of the government. That is why we have discussed this under the government debt. So that is it for today. We will continue with this chapter in the next video. Thank you so much for watching. I hope this was a useful one for you. I wish you all the very best.